Few political entities in human history have shaped the modern world as profoundly or as enduringly as the British Empire. At its height in the early 20th century, it covered roughly a quarter of the Earth's land surface, governed over 400 million people, and spanned every inhabited continent. From the icy harbours of Canada to the jungles of Malaya, from the African veldt to the industrial cities of Britain, and from the plains of India to the great shipping lanes of the Atlantic and Pacific, British power was global in both reach and consequence. No previous empire had operated on such a scale, with such geographic breadth, or for such a sustained period of time. The British Empire did more than conquer territory. It connected distant societies into a single economic, political, and cultural system. It moved people, goods, ideas, laws, technologies, and institutions across oceans and continents. In doing so, it helped to create the interconnected world we now take for granted. A world of global trade, international law, shared languages, and common political concepts. Its legacy, however, is complex, contested, and often emotionally charged. It is a story of exploration and conquest, commerce and coercion, law and exploitation, evangelism and empire. It is also a story of continuity, of institutions, languages, borders, and political traditions that continue to structure global life long after the imperial flag was lowered. Any serious treatment must confront its failures and injustices honestly, yet also grapple with the undeniable reality that the British Empire helped to construct much of the political, economic, and cultural architecture of the modern world. England's imperial story did not begin with grand designs of world domination. In the late medieval period, England was a relatively minor European power, inward-looking and preoccupied with dynastic conflict, religious upheaval, and continental wars. Compared to Spain, France, or the Holy Roman Empire, England lacked population, wealth, and military reach. Its ambitions were initially defensive rather than imperial. The transformation began in the 16th century. Maritime innovation, Protestant rivalry with Catholic Spain, and the rise of a commercially minded gentry and merchant class combined to push England outward. Advances in ship design, navigation, gunnery, and cartography allowed English sailors to travel further and more reliably than previous generations. The sea became England's greatest asset. Privateers such as Francis Drake and John Hawkins blurred the line between commerce and warfare, striking Spanish shipping while enriching investors and the crown. These ventures were risky and often brutal, but they demonstrated the strategic power of naval dominance and global trade. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 did not instantly create an empire, but it shattered the myth of Spanish naval invincibility and marked a psychological turning point. England and later Britain, after the 1707 Acts of Union, began to see itself as a maritime nation with a destiny tied to the oceans. The 17th century saw the establishment of colonies in North America and the Caribbean. These early settlements were frequently chaotic, underfunded, and brutally difficult, marked by disease, starvation, and conflict with indigenous peoples. Yet they also created something historically distinctive: overseas societies that reproduced British law, language, religious practice, and political culture. Unlike purely extractive empires, Britain increasingly exported people as well as power, laying the groundwork for settler societies that would eventually become self-governing nations. Trade was the lifeblood of the British Empire. More than conquest alone, it was commerce that bound the empire together and justified its expansion. British imperialism was, at its core, commercial in character, focused on markets, contracts, shipping, and finance. Chartered companies such as the East India Company acted as the cutting edge of imperial growth. These organizations blended commerce, diplomacy, and military force, often ruling vast territories on behalf of the crown. The imperial system knitted together distant regions into a global trading network that moved goods, capital, and ideas at unprecedented scale. Cotton from India, sugar from the Caribbean, tea from China, rubber from Malaya, wool from Australia, and manufactured goods from Britain flowed along shipping routes protected by the Royal Navy. London emerged as the financial centre of the world, underwriting insurance, credit, and investment on a global scale. This system was not morally clean. The Atlantic slave trade remains one of the empire's darkest chapters, and Britain was deeply complicit in it during the 17th and 18th centuries. Enslaved Africans were transported in horrific conditions to work on plantations that enriched British merchants and consumers. This reality cannot be minimized or excused. Yet historical honesty demands a fuller picture. Britain also became the first major power to abolish the slave trade, 1807, and then slavery itself, 1833, at enormous financial cost and against significant economic interest. These reforms were driven largely by Christian moral conviction, evangelical activism, and a growing belief that slavery was incompatible with natural law, human dignity, and the Christian understanding of the person. A belief articulated and embodied by figures such as William Wilberforce, whose tireless parliamentary leadership gave abolition its legislative force. Olaudah Equiano, whose first-hand testimony as a former slave exposed the brutal realities of the trade to the British public. And John Newton, a former slave trader turned Anglican minister, whose repentance and preaching helped awaken the Christian conscience of the nation. What made British abolitionism historically unique was that it did not end at legislation. The Royal Navy was deployed as an instrument of moral policy. For decades, British warships patrolled the Atlantic, the Caribbean, and the West African coast, intercepting slave ships, freeing captives, and dismantling slave trading networks. British sailors boarded foreign vessels, including Spanish and Portuguese slavers, often at great personal risk, in a sustained global campaign against human trafficking. This naval war against slavery was costly, dangerous, and unprecedented. Thousands of British sailors died from disease and combat while enforcing abolition. Yet Britain persisted, using its imperial power not merely to prohibit slavery within its own domains, but to pressure other nations into abolition treaties and to enforce those agreements at sea. No other empire committed comparable resources to ending a practice that had existed in virtually every civilization throughout history. The abolitionist campaign illustrates a broader truth about the British Empire. It was capable of moral reform and self-correction on a global scale. Rooted in Christian ethics and sustained by imperial power, Britain transformed itself from a participant in slavery into its most powerful enemy, leaving a legacy that reshaped international norms and permanently altered the moral landscape of the modern world. The British Empire expanded through war, exploration, and trade deals, but it also maintained long periods of relative peace. The 19th century is often described as the era of Pax Britannica, during which British naval dominance suppressed piracy, protected shipping lanes, and stabilized global trade. For much of the world, this meant fewer large-scale wars, greater predictability, and safer commercial exchange. Imperial wars were often brutal and asymmetrical, and critics rightly note episodes of excessive force, cultural arrogance, and misjudgment. Campaigns on the northwest frontier of India, in southern Africa, or during the suppression of rebellions could be harsh by modern standards. These conflicts left real scars and grievances. Yet the empire also confronted and dismantled older systems of violence that had long plagued many regions. Practices such as ritual human sacrifice, endemic slavery, widespread banditry, piracy, and constant intertribal warfare were curtailed or eliminated in many areas under British rule. Imperial authority, backed by law and military power, imposed a degree of order that allowed agriculture, trade, and urban life to develop with greater security and continuity. In the 20th century, the empire played a decisive role in 2 world wars. Britain and its empire resisted German militarism, fascism, and Nazi totalitarianism at immense cost. Colonial troops from India, Africa, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the Caribbean fought and died in conflicts that shaped the fate of global civilization. The defeat of Nazism and Japanese imperialism cannot be understood without the imperial system that mobilized men, material, industry, and global logistics on an unprecedented scale. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the British Empire lies in its institutions. British rule exported systems of common law, civil administration, parliamentary practice, and professional bureaucracy. These institutions were not always applied consistently or justly, but they proved remarkably durable and adaptable across cultures. British administrators placed great emphasis on record-keeping, codified law, and predictable governance. Courts, civil services, tax systems, and local administrations were established across vast territories, often incorporating existing customs within a broader legal framework. Over time, these systems created a shared political vocabulary that transcended ethnic, religious, and regional divisions. Many former colonies retained British legal frameworks after independence because they worked. Independent judiciaries, merit-based civil services, and constitutional government offered stability in societies facing enormous post-colonial pressures. Countries such as India, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, and numerous African states continue to operate within legal and political traditions shaped by British rule. By contrast, in some cases where post-independence regimes deliberately dismantled or repudiated these inherited institutions, abandoning the rule of law, professional administration, and constitutional restraint, states experienced sharp decline, instability, and even collapse, underscoring the practical value of what had been built. The English language itself became a global lingua franca, enabling international diplomacy, science, higher education, and commerce. While cultural dominance can be controversial, the practical benefits of a shared administrative and commercial language, particularly in multilingual societies, are undeniable. The British Empire was not only a political or economic project, but an explicitly moral and religious one. From its earliest phases, British expansion was deeply shaped by Christianity, particularly Protestant Christianity, and by the conviction, widely held among elites and ordinary people alike, that Britain had a providential role to play in spreading Christian civilization. Unlike many empires, Britain did not merely tolerate religion as a private matter. Christianity was embedded into its imperial identity. The monarchy was explicitly Christian. Parliament legislated within a Christian moral framework. And the Church of England, alongside nonconformist Protestant denominations, understood imperial expansion as an opportunity for evangelism and moral reform. Missionary societies such as the Church Missionary Society, the London Missionary Society, and later evangelical movements became central actors in imperial life. Missionaries, teachers, engineers, doctors, administrators, and reformers accompanied soldiers and traders across the empire. Churches, schools, universities, libraries, and printing presses followed the flag. In many regions, missionaries were the first to learn local languages, develop written scripts, translate the Bible, and preserve indigenous histories. Literacy, often taught so that converts could read scripture, became one of the most transformative legacies of British rule. Christian missions, though sometimes entangled with imperial power, frequently challenged local abuses and injustices. Missionaries were among the earliest and most vocal critics of slavery, human sacrifice, infanticide, widow burning, and ritual violence. In India, Africa, and the Pacific, Christian teaching promoted the dignity of the individual, the moral equality of all people before God, and the sanctity of human life, ideas that directly undermined older systems of caste, hereditary bondage, and arbitrary power. Education was inseparable from this Christian vision. Mission schools produced a new educated elite fluent in English, trained in Western moral philosophy, and familiar with Christian ethics. Many future nationalist leaders, including lawyers, journalists, and statesmen, were educated in Christian institutions. Ironically, the moral and political arguments later used against empire, human rights, liberty, equality before the law, were often learned within a Christian imperial framework. Christian moral values also shaped imperial reform. Evangelical Christianity played a decisive role in the abolition of the slave trade and slavery itself, prison reform, the protection of indigenous peoples, and campaigns against cruelty and exploitation. The empire was not morally static. It was capable of self-criticism and reform precisely because it operated within a Christian moral tradition that judged power accountable to higher law. The empire also facilitated cultural exchange within a broadly Christian civilizational framework. British literature, hymnody, sport, legal norms, Sabbath observance, charitable institutions, and civic traditions took root overseas, while Britain absorbed influences from across the world in food, language, music, and ideas. Cricket, parliamentary debate, voluntary associations, and church-based social life became shared reference points across vast distances, creating a sense, however imperfect, of a common moral and civic culture. While the British Empire operated on a global scale, its impact is best understood through concrete regional examples. In several territories, British rule did not merely extract resources, but established the conditions for prosperity, security, and long-term development. Southern Africa and the Indian subcontinent offer particularly instructive case studies. In Southern Africa, British administration played a decisive role in transforming regions marked by instability, endemic conflict, and limited infrastructure into some of the most economically developed societies on the continent. In Rhodesia, modern Zimbabwe, and Zambia, British settlers and administrators introduced large-scale commercial agriculture, mining, railways, and modern urban centres. Rail links connected the interior to ports, integrating the region into global trade networks. Property law, banking systems, and stable administration enabled long-term investment and economic growth. For several decades in the 20th century, Rhodesia was among the most productive agricultural regions in Africa, exporting food rather than relying on aid. While later political developments tragically reversed much of this progress, the prosperity achieved under British-derived institutions was real, measurable, and historically significant. In South Africa, British rule followed and modified earlier Dutch settlement, but it was under British administration that modern South Africa took institutional shape. Britain abolished slavery at the Cape, established a more uniform legal system, expanded ports and railways, and integrated the region into global finance and industry. The discovery of diamonds and gold led to rapid industrialization, with British capital and engineering expertise transforming the economy. Cities such as Cape Town and Johannesburg became major commercial hubs. The British transformation of India was one of the most ambitious administrative projects in history. When Britain consolidated control in the 18th and 19th centuries, the subcontinent was politically fragmented, economically stagnant in many regions, and frequently ravaged by war, banditry, and arbitrary rule. British administration brought unprecedented political unity to India. A single legal framework, professional civil service, and codified law replaced a patchwork of competing authorities. The introduction of common law principles, regular taxation, and predictable governance created conditions for economic stability and investment. Infrastructure development was transformative. Britain built one of the largest railway networks in the world, along with roads, canals, ports, and telegraph systems. These projects dramatically reduced travel times, lowered the cost of moving goods, and integrated regional markets. Farmers could sell produce further afield. Merchants could trade with greater certainty. And famine relief could be organised more effectively than under pre-colonial systems. Education and language policy also reshaped India. English became a unifying administrative language across hundreds of ethnic and linguistic groups. Universities, colleges, and schools produced a professional class of lawyers, engineers, doctors, and administrators who would later govern independent India. Far from erasing Indian civilization, British rule helped preserve ancient texts, codify laws, and stimulate intellectual renewal through engagement with Western science and philosophy. Beyond individual regions, the British Empire provided a global system of security that made long-distance travel and trade safer than at any previous point in history. The Royal Navy suppressed piracy across the world's oceans, protected merchant shipping, and enforced freedom of navigation. Trade routes that had once been perilous became reliable arteries of global commerce. Imperial ports, coaling stations, and maritime law enabled ships to travel vast distances with predictable rules and protections. Merchants, missionaries, scientists, and ordinary travellers could move with a degree of safety unknown in earlier eras. This security underpinned the explosion of global trade in the 19th century and accelerated the spread of technology, medicine, and knowledge. Taken together, these examples illustrate a broader pattern. Where British rule was stable and sustained, it tended to produce order, infrastructure, economic integration, and institutional capacity. These were not accidental byproducts, but core features of British imperial governance. No honest account can ignore imperial failures. Famines in India, racial hierarchies, economic exploitation, and episodes of repression represent real suffering. Some policies were shaped by arrogance or indifference, others by the genuine limits of 19th century economic theory and scientific understanding. Yet historical judgment must be comparative, not abstract. The British Empire did not operate in a vacuum. It replaced older empires and power structures that were often far more brutal, unstable, and exploitative. In many regions, pre-imperial realities included practices and conditions that modern observers rightly find abhorrent. Ritual, human, and child sacrifice, cultic violence, and coercive sexual practices, witch doctor rule and trial by ordeal, endemic tribal warfare and ethnic cleansing, widespread slavery and raiding, chronic insecurity of travel, arbitrary justice, and recurrent famine intensified by lawlessness and constant conflict. British rule did not eliminate suffering, but it systematically suppressed these practices through law, policing, and Christian moral reform, replacing them with courts, contracts, protected roads and ports, medical provision, famine relief mechanisms, and a general expectation of the sanctity of human life. In many regions, British withdrawal led not to immediate freedom and prosperity, but to ethnic conflict, authoritarianism, and economic collapse, suggesting that imperial rule had been restraining deeper structural problems rather than creating them. Modern moral standards cannot simply be projected backwards without distortion. The more serious historical question is whether the empire, on balance, advanced human welfare relative to realistic alternatives available at the time. The decline of the British Empire was not primarily the result of moral failure, but of historical exhaustion. 2 world wars drained Britain economically and demographically, leaving it unable to sustain imperial commitments. Anti-colonial nationalism grew stronger, often using British political ideas, representation, constitutionalism, and rights against British rule itself. Decolonisation, though sometimes violent, was largely orderly compared to the collapse of other empires. Britain negotiated independence, transferred institutions, trained administrators, and maintained relationships through the Commonwealth, a voluntary association rather than a coercive system. Former colonies were not abandoned without preparation, but inherited functioning states, legal systems, and civil services. The end of empire didn't mean the end of influence. British legal systems, educational models, and cultural norms continued to shape former colonies long after formal rule ended, and Britain itself remained deeply connected to the wider world it had once governed. Was the British Empire a net good for the world? The answer depends on evidence rather than sentiment. By any measurable standard, life expectancy, literacy, infrastructure, political stability, and integration into global trade, many regions improved dramatically under British rule and retained those gains after independence. The empire was not benevolent in every instance, nor enlightened by modern standards, but it was comparatively restrained, reformable, and ultimately self-critical in ways rare among empires. It abolished slavery, expanded legal rights, fostered gradual political participation, and eventually dismantled itself without total collapse or global war. The modern world, its borders, institutions, and shared norms cannot be understood without the British Empire. To acknowledge its net positive contribution is not to deny its sins, but to insist on historical seriousness rather than ideological caricature. The British Empire was a civilizational force, flawed, human, often contradictory, but historically consequential in ways that continue to shape our lives. It spread trade, law, language, and institutions that underpin modern global society. It defeated older evils and newer tyrannies. To study the British Empire honestly is not to engage in nostalgia or condemnation, but to confront the complexity of history itself. Its legacy is not something to be erased or worshipped, but understood.